Heroics and Other Things That Don't Require Superpowers by the Narator. Chapter 1. The Trouble with Quirks, or Lack Thereof. Izuku stared up at the illuminated board, wondering what the hell he was even doing here. Besides him, he knew Shota, and was wondering the same thing. Neither of them had quirks particularly suited to rescue scenarios, and certainly wouldn't do any good to the 10 or so people currently shuffling about dazedly on the catwalk that ran just beneath the bottom of the billboard. All attempts to calm them down had been fruitless, and clearly they were still under the effects of whatever quirk had possessed them to climb up there in the first place. It was obvious that they would need to be gotten down all at once, or some of them might fall in the confusion. Izuku knew he couldn't be of any help in that department, but as a hero, it was his duty to help in any way he could. A few dozen yards away, behind the police line, a news crew was setting up, and Shota was eyeing them with distaste. They had missed the better part of the attack, including the long chase down the dark, but still mildly busy street in which the villain's quirk activation power had caused several people to lose control of their quirks, creating a great deal of chaos for the heroes to deal with before they could catch the perpetrator. The 10 victims were still under the effect of one of those haywire quirks was the best spectacle they could hope for, and they weren't about to miss what was left of the story. Izuku knew the hero Eraserhead would stay as long as it took to get the victims safely, but he also knew his friend Shota wouldn't like to be on camera. "I could just scoop them up in my arms," argued Mount Lady, currently at her smaller size as she talked strategy with the 5 other heroes present, including Eraserhead and Present Mike. "Too risky," countered Kamui Woods, shaking his head. "You'd be lucky if you didn't knock any of them off. They're not exactly going to be working with you." He offered no alternative solution, and Izuku privately thought he might have been just stalling until the cameras were set up. "Maybe we should just get the police to set up their air pad," Shota said, sounding rather convincingly bored and disaffected. It would have taken someone who knew him well to see how anxious he was to have this over with. Izuku opened his mouth to second that idea, despite how long it would take, when suddenly a flash of movement at the police line drew his eye. He turned, just in time to see a young boy straightening from where he had ducked under the police tape. He was short, with a mop of messy, curly green hair, but the boy dodged nimbly between the policeman's arms and continued on towards the base of the billboard. All the assembled heroes were busy arguing with one another, so none of them besides Izuku noticed the kid march quickly up the large electrical box at the base of the billboard, besides the covered ladder that gave access to the catwalk, and pull the enormous switch that controlled the main power supply. Abruptly, bright lights that illuminated the billboard from below shut down with a loud noise, a deep finality, leaving the catwalk in darkness. The attention of the rest of the heroes was caught at once, and one of them actually swore when he saw who it was that turned out the lights. But before any of them could move, the kid had pulled out a flashlight, clicked it on, and shone the beam up to the covered ladder. Izuku looked up, following the beam of light, to see that it had become a bright spot in the midst of a crowd of the catwalk. The victims all crowded around it, looking down at the hole, and then one of them knelt and began climbing down the ladder. The covering was only a wire cage, meant to prevent accidental falls, but it kept the victim soundly in place as he calmly climbed down to the ground. As soon as there was room, there was a woman who knelt down and began climbing down as well, the clustered crowd seemingly patient to wait their turn to climb down safely. "Kid!" called Shota, beginning to move towards the boy, but Izuku flung out a hand. When Shota looked at him, Izuku pointed up to the catwalk. "Well," said one of the others in surprise, "possibly Kamui Woods." "Never would have thought of that," said someone else, but Izuku wasn't paying much attention. The billboard was rooted in an alleyway between 2 shops along the commercial street. The base was shrouded in shadow, so the kid's flashlight was their brightest point in the dark. As the victims began to get off the ladder, they clustered around the kid, bumping him as they jock-eyed for position, trying to get close to the light. Once there were 3 of them down, the kid started having trouble keeping them steady, as all of them were bigger than him, and he obviously was trying to make sure the light stayed in place. Don't just stand there, Shota suddenly barked, forcing his way past Hisashi's hand and making purposely for the kid. Help the boy! The rest of the heroes immediately leaped into action, each of them taking a victim by the arm and leading them gently to the small cluster of ambulances that had gathered at the edge of the police line. There were 6 heroes and 10 victims, so 4 of them had to go back for more, but Hisashi and Shota let the other heroes have the limelight as they melted into the crowd. Eyes on the kid with the flashlight. As soon as all the other victims were safe, the kid clicked off his flashlight and looked around nervously, but could see that no one was looking at him. Quickly he began to creep back towards the police line, obviously intent on slipping away into the crowd, and he jumped and cried out when Shota's hand came on his shoulder. "Come with me," Shota ordered sternly, and the kid gulped. Shota and Hisashi towed the kid behind one of the ambulances, out of sight of the cameras and most of the onlooking crowd. The kid's eyes were darting left and right as though looking for an escape, but when Shota let go of his arm, he turned to face the 2 heroes with a sheepish expression. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, his voice high and anxious. I couldn't let those people get hurt, and none of the heroes were doing anything. I just had to make sure." "You're not in trouble," said Shota firmly. The kid stopped rambling and blinked up at him, nonplussed. Hisashi didn't have to look at Shota to see how hard his expression was. He was probably frightening the kid. "Hey," Hisashi struck a pose, turning on all of his present mic charm. "That was some rockin' quick thinking you displayed just now. How'd you know that would work?" Hisashi felt Shota's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly at the appearance of his more flamboyant persona, but it had the desired effect. The child relaxed, exhaling shakily, and smiled weakly up at the 2 heroes. I was there when those people got hit," he explained. "They thought they were moths, so they were drawn to the biggest light source. That was the billboard, so I just shut off the light and gave them something else to be drawn to." Hisashi glanced at Shota, who was giving the kid a contemplative look. "You go to UA," he said. It wasn't a question. The kid gulped again. "Yes, sir," he said, answering him anyway. "I know every kid in Class 1A and 1B, Shota informed him. This was true. He and Hisashi always made it a point to know all the hero students by sight, even though it was only at the end of the first week of school. "You're not in the hero course? The support course, maybe?" "No, sir." The kid shook his head. "I'm in 1C, the Gen Ed course. I just like to study quirks. It's a bit of a hobby." The kid slid his bright yellow backpack off his shoulders and opened it, tucking it away the flashlight and pulling out a notebook. It was battered, and it looked like it was almost burned in places, with what looked like water damage in others. On the cover was written, "Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13, in black ink. Shota took the notebook and began to flip through it. His expression didn't change, but Hisashi could tell that he was quite interested. He also seemed content to leave the kid and Hisashi waiting while he read, so Hisashi cast around for something to say to keep the kid from panicking. His eyes were again drawn to the cover and back cover of the notebook. He was sure those were burn marks. "Seems like the notebook's seen better days," Hisashi said carefully. "You get into a lot of scraps with this hobby of yours." "Oh no!" The kid shook his head vehemently, his dark green hair flopping back and forth. "I always stay behind the police line when I watch hero fights. I never get in the way. Well, except for that one time. But that's not how my notebook got messed up." "What happened then?" Hisashi asked, his smile firmly in place, trying to let the kid know that he wasn't going to press the issue of that one time any further than the kid was willing to volunteer. The kid, however, cast his eyes down. "My friend Kachan used his quirk on it," he explained, sounding dejected. "I don't think he wanted to destroy it. He just, wanted to show off." "Property damage doesn't exactly top the charts of the best way to show off your quirk," Hisashi pressed, keeping his tone light and upbeat, keeping his voice gentle. "Yeah, well," the boy shrugged, looking more defeated than before. "That was the same day he told me to jump off the roof, so I don't think he was really worried about property damage." Anger welled up in Hisashi so fast he went breathless with it. He could feel his eyes narrowing, his lips curling in disgust, but the kid was still looking at the ground and didn't notice right away. He couldn't afford to let this kid see his expression. It would only frighten him more. But the mention of suicide baiting struck a chord with Hisashi in a way that only true villainy tended to. "Mike," said Shota, pulling Hisashi's attention abruptly onto him. "There's an entry for you in here." Hisashi blinked. "What?" Shota turned the notebook around, displaying the page that he'd been looking at. At the top of the page was written, "Present Mike," and halfway down the opposite page was a surprisingly detailed sketch of his speaker. His eyes flicked over the clean lines of kanji, and before he knew what he was doing, he had taken the book from Shota to read the analysis better. It was an incredibly sophisticated breakdown of his quirk and fighting style, noting both his strengths and limitations. Scattered throughout the entry were questions, musing about the potential uses and applications of Hisashi's quirk, and whether or not he'd ever consider incorporating specific moves into his fighting style. Hisashi was surprised to realize there were questions that not even he had considered. Could his quirk potentially do that? "I have another entry in an earlier notebook," the kid assured him as he read. "It's from a while ago, though, so I decided to update it recently. I think the original Present Mike entry is way back in Journal 6. Hisashi opened his mouth to inquire how long the kid had been doing this, and how many heroes he'd practiced his analysis on, when a loud cry from the police line drew the kid's attention. Hisashi turned to look as well, to find another boy in a UA form, this one with purple hair sticking straight up and prominent bags under his eyes, bursting through a knot of policemen trying to hold him back. He stumbled a little, nearly falling over as his forward momentum carried him out of the reach of their grasping fingers, but he quickly righted himself and sprinted a few yards where Hisashi and Shota stood talking to his classmate. "What?" Shota began, looking at the newcomer, but was immediately silenced as the purple-haired kid bent swiftly at the waist, bowing in earnest to respect the two heroes. "Please," he shouted, probably louder than he'd meant to. "Please don't blame Mito for what I did." Hisashi and Shota looked at each other, then back at the purple-haired kid. The kid whose notebook Hisashi was holding, Mito, if he had to hazard a guess, looked stricken, but said nothing. "What did you do?" Shota asked, after a moment of silence. The purple-haired kid stiffened, but didn't rise from his bow. "It was my quirk who convinced those people they were moths," he admitted shakily. "I got hit by that villain's quirk and lost control. Thinking they were moths was the most harmless thing I could think of, and then I got separated from the crowd so they couldn't hear my voice and—" "Please," said Mito, interrupting his classmate to bow equally low. "Don't blame Shin-chan. It was my idea that we should be out here so late. And then when the fight started, I wanted to get closer and see. I dragged him into the path of that villain, so if anyone's to blame, it was me." "Mito was only cleaning up my mess," Shin-chan insisted. "Please don't get mad at him." "Shin-chan's only here because of me," Mito countered. "Please—" "That's enough," said Shota harshly, his quirk causing his eyes to go red and his hair to stand on end. The two boys' heads snapped up, both of them obviously terrified, but almost immediately Shota dropped his quirk. "Neither of you is in trouble." Both boys straightened, looking at each other in confusion. "Really?" asked Shin-chan shakily. "You're not going to get us in trouble?" Hisashi struck a pose again. "Being caught in a villain attack isn't a crime," he said, as loudly and as enthusiastically as he could without drawing the attention to their conversation. "No one got hurt, so it's good vibes only." Both boys exhaled audibly, their shoulders slumping in obvious relief. Shota gave him a look, but didn't comment on his antics. Instead, he looked back at Mito. "I just have one question," he said, making Mito tense again, and Shin-chan looked at him nervously. "If you two were both in the thick of it during the fight, why didn't your quirk go haywire too?" Mito suddenly looked ashamed, his eyes on his shoes and mouth twisted into a wibbling line, his cheeks growing red under their scrutiny. Hisashi wanted to say something to put the boys at ease again, but he knew Shota wouldn't appreciate it if he didn't get his answer first. I don't have a quirk," Mito said quietly. Hisashi barely caught himself before letting his mouth drop open. This boy studied quirks like a professional analyst, diffused what amounted to a hostage situation with a flashlight, ran towards danger, then away from it, if it meant he might learn something. And he did it with no quirk at all. Shota took the notebook from Hisashi's slack fingers and handed it back to Mido. Be more careful next time, he instructed both boys, and when they nodded furiously, he gestured back towards the police line. You're not in trouble, so get going. I'm sure your parents are worried about you. Neither boy needed telling twice. They turned and ran back to the police tape, ducking under and immediately disappearing into the crowd. Shota and Hisashi watched them go, Hisashi still in shock and Shota with a contemplative expression. What's on your mind? Asked Hisashi, recovering himself in a few moments of silence. Shota turned, his face reverting to its usual bored expression. Nothing, he said, dismissively. Come on, those vultures should be clearing off soon. And I don't want to get asked for an interview. I can't believe that happened, Izuku exclaimed, once they were clear of the crowd and headed back towards the train station. I can't believe we didn't get arrested, moaned Shinso, passing a hand over his eyes in exhaustion. Not that, Izuku waved him off. I mean, I can't believe we just met President Mike and Eraserhead. I know they teach at the school, but we met them. Trust you to be more interested in the heroes than the danger, Shinso said without heat. You could probably get attacked by a villain yourself, and you'd still be more interested in who came to save you. Come on, Izuku said. You're telling me you don't care that you've met the Eraserhead? That you spoke to him even? Suddenly, Shinso stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. That was my first conversation with Eraserhead, he said, staring into space in horror. Yep, said Izuku brightly. I spoke to him for the first time ever, Shinso continued. You sure did, Izuku confirmed. And I was a colossal tool, Shinso said, slapping his hand over his face in mortification. I was apologizing for putting people in danger. I was so nervous I barely remember what he said to me. Izuku's enthusiasm faded a bit, knowing what Shinso had been feeling right now. He had admired Eraserhead since elementary school, and been determined to get into the UA Hero course after finding out that he taught there. With his plans to get into the Hero course via the sports festival, Izuku knew that he had planned out his first conversation with his would-be teacher carefully. To know that his first impression had been unfavorable had to be devastating. However, Izuku knew what best would cheer him up. Well, I remember what he didn't say, he said, less brightly, but with a gentle nudge in Shinzu's shoulder with his own. What? Shinzu said, glumly. He didn't say you had a villain's quirk, Izuku reminded him. Shinzo looked at him, his eyes full of realization, surprise, and just a touch of wonder. No, he said slowly. He didn't he? Izuku gave him a little snort of laughter, and then took off again towards home, his best friend trailing behind him.